In a world that often rewards deception, where the bold and ruthless rise to the top, what happens to the good? Are kindness and honesty virtues or liabilities? This question isn't new. Over 500 years ago, a man named Niccolo Machiavelli asked the same thing and came to a brutal conclusion. Machiavelli's name has become a symbol of manipulation and cold-blooded strategy. But his real message, it's more complex and more relevant than ever. In this video, we're exploring the price of goodness, according to Machiavelli, and why being virtuous in a ruthless world might cost more than you think. Let's break it down in 5 parts, from the chaos of his time to the cunning of the fox, and finally, to the eternal question, can good people win? To understand Machiavelli's view of goodness, we first have to understand the world he lived in. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't stable. It wasn't forgiving. Niccolo Machiavelli was born in 1469 in Florence, a city-state at the heart of Renaissance Italy. But this Renaissance wasn't all art and humanism. It was also a time of ruthless political struggle. Italy wasn't a unified country back then. It was a patchwork of constantly warring city-states like Venice, Milan, Florence, and the Papal States. On top of that, foreign powers like France and Spain invaded regularly, hoping to carve out influence for themselves. In this chaotic environment, power changed hands frequently, sometimes violently. Alliances were made and broken. Friends became enemies overnight. Princes, popes, and generals played a brutal game, where failure didn't just mean losing office, it could mean exile, imprisonment, or assassination. This was the world Machiavelli saw with his own eyes. As a diplomat for Florence, he was sent on missions across Italy and beyond. He met kings and popes, observed court intrigues, and saw firsthand how power really worked. It left a mark on him. He learned that lofty ideals often had little weight when survival was on the line. It's no wonder, then, that Machiavelli became deeply skeptical of traditional morality, at least when it came to politics. He wasn't interested in how things should work. He wanted to understand how they actually worked. And what he saw disturbed him. Good people often failed, while cunning and ruthless leaders thrived. This is where his most famous work, The Prince, comes in. Written in 1513 after Machiavelli was dismissed and tortured by political rivals, The Prince was essentially a guidebook for rulers on how to gain and maintain power, even if that meant setting aside conventional ethics. One of his most famous lines drives this point home. A man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. In other words, if you always try to be virtuous in a corrupt world, you're setting yourself up to be crushed. To Machiavelli, the political arena wasn't governed by divine justice or moral rules. It was a battlefield, and if you walked into it unarmed, with only good intentions and clean hands, you wouldn't last long. Your enemies would not play by the same rules. They'd lie, bribe, betray, and if you weren't ready to respond in kind, you'd be swept away. But this doesn't mean Machiavelli hated virtue. He just didn't think it could survive on its own. He believed that a ruler had to be flexible. They had to know when to act morally, and when to abandon morality for the sake of stability, security, or survival. This was a radical view at the time. Most political philosophy before Machiavelli had been tied to ethics, especially the Christian virtues of mercy, honesty, humility, and selflessness. Machiavelli shattered that connection. He said, essentially, if you want to keep your people safe and your state strong, you might have to do things that are not so virtuous. To some, that made him a monster. To others, it made him a realist. But one thing is clear. Machiavelli's world was not a place where goodness guaranteed success. In fact, in his eyes, being too good could be dangerous, even fatal. This sets the stage for everything that follows. In Machiavelli's mind, morality and power are not always friends. And for a ruler, the price of goodness might be everything. Most people want their leaders to be good. We admire the idea of a wise, just ruler, someone who tells the truth, keeps their promises, protects the innocent, and governs with compassion. In every culture, there are legends of noble kings, philosopher leaders, and saintly presidents. We teach our children that honesty and kindness are strengths, but Machiavelli wasn't so sure. He believed that the idea of a purely good ruler was not just rare, it was a dangerous illusion, because in his experience, rulers who tried to be only good were quickly outmaneuvered, overthrown, or worse. The world, he argued, is too full of greed, betrayal, and ambition for such a person to last. This isn't to say that Machiavelli thought rulers should be evil for its own sake. Quite the opposite. He believed that morality had its place, but only when it served a larger purpose, the stability of the state and the survival of the ruler. If being honest or generous helped a leader stay in power and keep the peace, great. But if those virtues put them at risk, then they had to be abandoned, without hesitation. One of the most controversial passages in The Prince captures this perfectly. It is necessary for a prince to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity. This is where Machiavelli parts ways with traditional ethics. To him, goodness was not an absolute. It was a strategy, a tool to be used when useful, and discarded when it became a liability. He didn't believe in being cruel for the sake of cruelty, but he did believe in being cruel if it prevented chaos, rebellion, or weakness. Let's break that down. Imagine a ruler who is known for being merciful and forgiving. That might work until enemies begin to see him as soft. They push boundaries, betray alliances, maybe even challenge his rule. If he responds too kindly, he looks weak. If he punishes them harshly, people might call him a hypocrite, a good man turned tyrant. Now, imagine a different ruler, one who is feared but not hated, someone who rewards loyalty and punishes betrayal swiftly. This ruler might not be loved, but people respect him, and more importantly, they don't dare cross him. In Machiavelli's view, this second ruler is more likely to survive and more likely to protect his people in the long run. That leads to another one of Machiavelli's most quoted and most misunderstood ideas. It is much safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. He's not saying that fear is always better. He's saying that when push comes to shove, love is fragile. People's affections can disappear in hard times. But fear, if managed properly, is more reliable. It keeps people in line. It buys time. It ensures order. So, where does that leave goodness? In Machiavelli's world, goodness isn't a guiding light, it's camouflage. The best rulers, he said, knew how to appear virtuous even when they weren't. They looked honest, generous, religious, and merciful, even if their actions were cold and calculating behind the scenes. Because appearances matter, people judge what they see, not what actually happens behind closed doors. And that's the heart of the myth. A good ruler, in the eyes of the public, might be generous and noble. But in Machiavelli's view, the most effective rulers were often just playing a part, projecting virtue while doing what had to be done. This doesn't mean he admired tyrants. He wasn't advocating for chaos or cruelty for its own sake. He was trying to offer a survival guide for leaders in a brutal world. And in that world, being truly good, consistently, transparently, and without compromise, was not just unrealistic, it was suicidal. To understand Machiavelli's philosophy of power, we need to explore two of his most important and often misunderstood concepts, virtù and fortuna. These words don't translate cleanly into English, but they are the key to how Machiavelli viewed success, failure, and the role of character in a chaotic world. Let's start with virtù. Despite how it looks, virtù is not the same as virtue in the moral or Christian sense. It doesn't mean being kind, honest, or humble. For Machiavelli, virtù meant strength, decisiveness, courage, intelligence, and, most importantly, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. It was the quality that allowed a leader to shape events rather than be shaped by them. Think of virtù as strategic excellence. It's what allows a ruler to seize opportunity, command respect, and impose order on disorder. It's boldness, but not recklessness. Cunning, but not cowardice. It's the difference between merely holding power and truly mastering it. Now contrast that with fortuna, fortune. Machiavelli saw fortuna as the unpredictable force of luck, fate, or external conditions. In life and politics, we're constantly subject to things beyond our control. Wars, plagues, economic collapse, betrayals, even the moods of the public. Fortuna represents all those wild, uncontrollable elements. It's the storm you can't stop, the dice roll you can't rig, the universe reminding you that power, no matter how strong, is never absolute. In The Prince, Machiavelli famously compares fortune to a river. Fortune is a woman, and if you wish to master her, you must conquer her by force. And it is clear that she more often lets herself be conquered by men who act boldly than by those who proceed coldly. This provocative metaphor captures his attitude. Fortune may be wild and unpredictable, but it can be challenged. It can be resisted, not with prayer or virtue, but with boldness and action. The river might flood, but a wise and prepared ruler can build dams and defenses in advance. So, what does this have to do with goodness? Everything. In Machiavelli's mind, relying solely on goodness, being passive, idealistic, or overly cautious is a failure of virtù. It's like hoping the river won't rise instead of preparing for the flood. A good ruler isn't just reactive, they are proactive. They anticipate betrayal. They adapt when times change. They know when to pivot from kindness to ruthlessness and back again, if needed. This balance between virtù and fortuna explains why Machiavelli admired certain historical figures. Men like Cesare Borgia, brutal, strategic, unafraid to use cruelty to establish control, were not moral heroes. But to Machiavelli, they possessed virtù in abundance. They acted decisively. They bent fortune to their will, even if only temporarily. It's worth noting that Machiavelli did not believe fortune could be mastered completely. No one controls everything. Even the greatest leaders fall, sometimes through no fault of their own. But what separates the weak from the strong, he believed, is how much of their fate they try to control. Goodness, if it leads a leader to inaction, if it prevents them from confronting hard truths or taking unpopular decisions, becomes a liability. Virtù demands more than that. It demands the strength to do what must be done, even if it breaks the rules of conventional morality. This is the core of Machiavelli's realism. He wasn't saying that life is all about power, but he was saying that power is fragile, and those who wield it need more than good intentions. They need skill. They need adaptability. They need the courage to confront fortune head-on. In his view, the leaders who succeed are those who possess enough virtù to shape their own destiny, and enough wisdom to know when fortune is turning against them. If there's one image that captures the essence of Machiavelli's political philosophy, it's this. A ruler must learn to be both a lion and a fox. It's a simple metaphor, but a powerful one. And like most of Machiavelli's insights, it challenges our assumptions about leadership, morality, and the meaning of strength. So, what does it mean? According to the prince, the lion represents force, raw strength, power, courage, and intimidation. A lion doesn't need to hide its intentions. It attacks threats head-on and overpowers them with sheer might. But lions, Machiavelli warns, have a problem. They're not very good at spotting traps. They lack cunning. That's where the fox comes in. The fox is the opposite. It's clever, deceptive, strategic. A fox survives not through strength, but through trickery. It avoids danger, sets traps for others, and manipulates the battlefield from behind the scenes. But it too has a weakness. It cannot defend itself if caught. A fox may be sly, but it can't fight off wolves. So what does Machiavelli recommend? A prince must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves. In other words, you need both. Strength alone isn't enough. It leaves you vulnerable to schemes and manipulation. But cunning alone won't save you when it's time to fight. The ruler who succeeds must combine the brute power of the lion with the careful calculation of the fox. This combination is Machiavelli's answer to the challenge of surviving in a ruthless world. And it's his rejection of moral simplicity, because neither the lion nor the fox fits neatly into the box of goodness, at least not as most people define it. Let's think about what this means in practice. A good leader, by traditional standards, should be honest and open. Someone who tells the truth, keeps promises, and governs with transparency. But the fox knows that honesty can be dangerous. If your enemies know your plans, they can outmaneuver you. If you always keep your word, others will exploit you. Machiavelli even goes as far as saying, "A wise ruler ought not to keep faith when doing so would be against his interest." That's a shocking idea to modern ears. But remember, he isn't talking about private life. He's talking about power, war, and governance in a world filled with deception and betrayal. In such a world, naive honesty can lead to ruin. At the same time, raw aggression, the lion's way, has its limits too. A ruler who relies only on fear and violence can inspire hatred, resistance, and eventual rebellion. Fear, Machiavelli says, is useful, but only if it doesn't turn into hatred. The lion must be restrained, or its strength becomes self-destructive. So again, Machiavelli insists. The ruler must walk the line. They must be strong enough to command loyalty and prevent chaos, but also clever enough to manipulate, deceive, and survive political traps. It's a cold message, but not without purpose. To Machiavelli, the greatest threat to a ruler is not evil. It's naivety, being too trusting, too idealistic, too predictable. These are the traits that get leaders betrayed, invaded, or overthrown. So what's the cost of goodness in this equation? Well, if you always play the lion, strong but honest, someone will trap you. If you only play the fox, clever but weak, someone will crush you. But if you try to be purely good, refusing to lie, manipulate, or intimidate, you might not last long enough to do any good at all. That's the harsh reality Machiavelli saw. And whether we agree with him or not, his metaphor has endured, because it reflects a deep truth about leadership, strategy, and the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. At this point, You might be wondering, did Machiavelli have any faith in goodness at all? Or was he just advocating for ruthless ambition and moral compromise? The answer is more complicated and more human than we often give him credit for. While Machiavelli clearly believed that rigid morality could be fatal in politics, he didn't completely reject the idea of virtue. He wasn't advising rulers to be monsters for the sake of cruelty. His message wasn't, be evil. It was, be prepared to do what is necessary. And sometimes, what's necessary is goodness. Machiavelli believed that a leader who was universally hated couldn't hold power for long. Fear might keep people in line, but fear mixed with hatred breeds rebellion. For a ruler to maintain stability, he had to be respected, and that often meant appearing good, even when acting otherwise. But here's the twist. Machiavelli's advice wasn't just about appearances. In certain situations, he believed that actual goodness could serve political survival when used wisely. A generous act might win over a rival faction. Mercy might prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Justice might unify a divided people. In those moments, moral behavior was not just ethical, it was strategic. This brings us to a critical idea. In Machiavelli's thought, goodness is not a weakness unless it's naive. He didn't object to virtue. He objected to leaders who were enslaved by virtue, who clung to it blindly, even when the world demanded toughness. He respected those who could use goodness as a tool, who knew when to be merciful and when to be merciless, not because they were heartless, but because they understood the stakes. Let's take an example. Imagine a ruler who pardons a dangerous traitor, hoping the gesture will inspire loyalty. It sounds noble. But what if that traitor sees the pardon as weakness, betrays the ruler again, and plunges the state into chaos? Machiavelli would argue that the original act of mercy, though well-intentioned, was irresponsible. Now flip the scenario. A ruler executes the traitor swiftly and sends a clear message. Betrayal will not be tolerated. Order is preserved. Fear prevents further disloyalty. In this case, harshness might actually protect the greater good. To Machiavelli, that's a rational, even ethical, use of power. So yes, there is room for goodness in Machiavelli's world, but it's conditional, not absolute. Goodness is allowed, even admired, when it serves the larger goal, the preservation of the state, the protection of the people, the maintenance of order. This is what makes Machiavelli so challenging. He forces us to ask, is a ruler good because they act morally, or because they ensure peace and stability, even through immoral means? It's an uncomfortable question. But it's not so different from the debates we still have today. Should leaders tell the truth, even when it causes panic? Should they negotiate with bad actors to prevent war? Should they break rules to protect the public? We may not always like Machiavelli's answers, but he gives us a framework to face these questions honestly. At the end of the day, Machiavelli wasn't writing fairy tales about noble kings. He was offering a survival manual for real-world leaders in dangerous times. And in his view, being truly good in a ruthless world meant more than just having good intentions. It meant knowing how and when to use them. So, what is the price of goodness in a ruthless world? According to Machiavelli, it can be steep. Too steep, in fact, if you don't know how to protect it. Goodness, in his eyes, wasn't a shield. It wasn't something that could stand alone in a world filled with ambition, betrayal, and war. Left unguarded, goodness could be a trap, a weakness, a reason you fall, while more ruthless players survive. But that doesn't mean Machiavelli despised goodness. He just refused to romanticize it. To him, The ideal leader wasn't someone who rejected morality, but someone who knew how to use it wisely. Someone who could appear virtuous while making tough, even brutal decisions behind the scenes. Someone who could balance strength with cunning, compassion with control, and principle with pragmatism. In a perfect world, perhaps goodness would always triumph. But Machiavelli didn't live in a perfect world, and neither do we. His warning still echoes today. If you want to do good, if you want to lead, protect, and make a difference, then you must first survive. And survival, sometimes, means being willing to do what goodness alone cannot. The real price of goodness, then, isn't just sacrifice or struggle. It's the constant burden of knowing when to be good and when to be something else. That's Machiavelli's view. But what do you think? Can true goodness survive in a ruthless world? Or was Machiavelli right that power and virtue are rarely allies?